This is Fox 5 News Morning.
As the president gets ready for his first State of the Union address, he is dealing with a number of other things, including immigration policy and, of course, the continued rumors about the Russia investigation.
The fallout from reports that the president wanted to fire special counsel Robert Mueller last year did not die down over the weekend. Lawmakers on both sides pledging to keep Mueller's jobs safe.
Last time you and I were together, I told my Republican colleagues, leave him the hell alone, and that's still my advice.
I think it's important to understand that the president cannot directly fire Mr. Mueller. The only person who has that authority is the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, and he's the one who appointed Mr. Mueller in the first place.
I will do whatever it takes to make sure that Mr. Mueller can do his job. We're a rule of law nation before President Trump. We're going to be a rule of law nation after President Trump.
I don't think there's a need for legislation right now to protect Mueller. So we're raising an issue that's not. At the same time, we've got an issue about funding for the military.
But the question remains, if the president ordered Mueller to be fired or tried to cover up that he did, does that rise to the obstruction of justice level?
And what impact could that have on Mueller interviewing the president? Joining us now, Seth, a former federal prosecutor, now attorney with Dickinson Wright. Great to have you back this morning.
Thanks so much.
Let's start with that right now. As far as, first of all, does the president have to do this? We've heard the president say, look, I welcome this. We've also heard the White House attorneys are saying, not so fast.
Yeah, so ultimately he does have to do it. Bob Mueller has subpoena power, and if President Trump were to flatly refuse to testify, he could issue a grand jury subpoena and force the president to testify with two caveats. There's the Fifth Amendment he could plead, which has political ramifications, obviously, and something called the executive privilege, which has some caveats to it as well. But, generally speaking, yes, the president can be forced to testify.
And as the lawmakers said, is Mueller's job indeed safe?
Well,
legally.
So the president cannot directly fire Bob Mueller, but we could go through another Saturday night massacre, or he could try to eliminate the special counsel's office entirely. And that's why you hear calls for legislation to protect Bob Mueller coming from Congress.
All right, one more question about would he have to testify or not? The White House apparently looking into, I guess it would be an executive privilege right now, looking back at precedent-setting cases, saying, look, maybe the president doesn't have to divulge information that may be of this nature.
Well, that's possible in the sense that the executive privilege covers communications among the president and his senior staff and the executive department. Couple points here that are important, though. That's, of course, once he's president. So anything that's pre-January 20th, 2017 is not subject to that. So all the key information relating to conspiracy between the Russians and the Trump team, that's not subject to executive privilege. And finally, the executive privilege, if Bob Mueller would make a sufficient showing of need, in other words, this was designed to cover up misconduct within the executive office, a court could overrule or trump that executive privilege claim.
Let's say Mueller gets that interview with the president. What's the line of questioning expected to be, especially with the president set already speaking with some other very high-profile people like Jeff Sessions?
Sure, I think it'll come in two forms. One is the case of conspiracy between the Russians and Trump pre-election, and then the obstruction post-election. I think Bob Mueller will dig in deep on both areas. And for me, I think Trump's endgame right now has to do with what would ultimately happen in the Senate should impeachment occur. There needs to be 67 senators to vote to remove the president himself. And in the Nixon era, he faced a hostile Senate. There were only 9 Republicans that needed to defect to impeach remove the president. And of course, he saw that writing on the wall. Trump faces a much different scenario. There needs to be 18 Republican senators to defect at this point, and we hear no discussion of that happening.
You're talking impeachment here.
Well, if it comes to that, and of course the obstruction evidence has risen to, I would think, a new level, and clearly on the Democratic side, you hear calls for impeachment already.
So along that line of thinking, as a former federal prosecutor yourself, what would the president have to do to get himself in trouble? Because as we know, this is a president who speaks his mind, and that's, I think, a lot of the fear of his attorneys is maybe he says something that would not be attorney speak or something that, they would direct him to say. But by that line of thinking, if he's looking at it like, hey, I need to get this many Republicans to come on board, what would he have to say that would be most harmful to him?
In an interview with Bob Mueller? So would be most harmful, of course, is to lie. I mean, there's something called a perjury trap or false statements. If he was to go in there and make a false statement, that alone could result in charges and articles of impeachment. Infamously, Martha Stewart faced that exact scenario. She was not convicted of the underlying securities fraud. She went to jail because she sat in a room with FBI agents and lied about, material matters. So I know his lawyers are having a hard time controlling him, it seems, but that's going to be the key. And if he goes in there and is truthful, or claims I don't recall is a statement sometimes we
Or
hear.
pleading the fifth. Can he do that?
Well, sure, he absolutely can do that. Now, the political ramifications for that could be very serious. I mean, if the President of the United States refuses to answer questions because they will incriminate him, that's what he's saying by pleading the fifth, I can only imagine how that would play in the public and potentially in impeachment proceedings.
Okay, and do you, Seth, before we let you go, how much of the public will know about what really does go on in this this meeting between Mueller and the president if it happens?
Very little. That will likely, if it's in the grand jury, it's secret and it won't be disclosed at all. If it's behind closed doors, say they accommodate him by doing that interview at the White House in an office, in large part, I would say initially very little. If there were impeachment proceedings or a trial, and that is likely to be videotaped, that line of questioning, then I think at that point you'd see it much like in Bill Clinton.
Much like in Bill Clinton.
So along that line, though, based on what we've seen from the White House, might it come down then, whatever word comes out from this, that it would be President Trump's word versus Bob Mueller's word?
When you're trying to prove obstruction and criminal intent, and that's what this is about, it's very difficult to get into someone's mind. So that's the way prosecutors look at this, is it's difficult to, have a he said, she said, or he said, and overcome that. What you do is you build a case by surrounding circumstances. You show the pattern, the firing of Jim Comey, the demand for Jeff Sessions to not recuse himself, so he's there to protect the president. Of course, now the attempted firing of Bob Mueller. And what a prosecutor will do is show a pattern in practice of activities that circumstantially builds a case to prove obstruction.
Former federal prosecutor Seth Waxman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.